Hello, my name is Eric Moore, though some of you may know me as Happy Computer Guy here on YouTube. I'm joining you for an update on my video from a year ago on GenAI practice and ethics. And I'm so excited to be revisiting the past year and talking about where I see an emerging topic in AI, which is constructivism versus foundationalism. And I'll define those terms since they're fairly new and I wouldn't say controversial, but certainly need definition. Then we'll move on to some of discussion of where multi-agent systems are. And finally, we will talk a little bit about an update to my ethical model. So before we get started, thank you so much for joining me today. And my background is principally in computer science, though I did go to school for philosophy. So please, take everything from that point of view. And all viewpoints are my own and not those of my employer. So what has changed in the last year? First off, the emergence of GPT-4o1, I would argue, as a reasoning agent, is indicative of a frontier model level capability based on its performance on benchmarks. Very debatable. We only have about 3-4 weeks of data on GPT-4o1, and we have not seen it in agentic models. I haven't seen its performance on Gaia, for instance, PlanBench. There's a lot of different places I think that we would like to see more information, but what we're seeing so far is a significant leap in reasoning capability, though even the use of the term reasoning there is debatable, and we'll get to that. Next, the emergence of LangGraph and GraphRag. So LangGraph is a finite state machine, or FSM, approach to building applications with large language models. And it uses a concept where you lay out all of the state transitions as a table, as a graph. It ends up with some pretty complex code, but some very good results. You can write very formalized transitions from agent to agent and make some really cool stuff. And also GraphRag has become very popular, where you're able to use LLMs to extract entities from text, meaning things like nouns, verbs, relationships, entity relationships is what we would call them, etc., and build a graph, a knowledge graph of this information dynamically. And this came out of Microsoft research. So both of these have become very popular models, additional abilities for augmenting reasoning frameworks. Next is the DeepMind Doom engine. So this is from Google. They used Doom as the input to well, I'm not going to claim to understand how it works. The result is that you have a neural network of types that is producing the output of the game Doom dynamically based on the user input. And it's very convincing. So if you haven't seen it, it's really neat. But it's another area where we're seeing this Sora, S-O-R-A, from OpenAI type, almost spatial, what appears to be a type of spatial reasoning from these models, which is pretty neat. And also a big part of what philosophers and many AI theorists believe is missing from a full theory of mind being able to be achieved with these models. So that's very exciting. And finally, Gaia, which is the general AI assistant benchmark. We've seen in the last year Microsoft Research's multi-agent experiment, or MAE, be very successful, dominating the leaderboard on that. Recently, there was a new chatbot that took the spot on the general AI assistant leaderboard, and it was based on AutoGen also. So I've been keeping an eye on that as kind of a fascinating indicator of where that particular benchmark lies. I think that's very interesting for where the state of the art is. So let's get into what I believe is a foundational, I wouldn't say disagreement, but delineation in how people think about these models. On one side, I shouldn't say on one side, in one school of thought is constructivism. So, constructivism, examples for knowledge acquisition, you acquire knowledge through experience and interaction with the world. It's dynamic acquisition, so reinforcement learning, unsupervised learning, cognitive architectures, which is what I find really fascinating, all constructivist concepts. Foundationalism, we're looking more at predefined rules and principles. And you can absolutely incorporate mechanisms for dynamic knowledge acquisition into a foundationalist model, but there's more of an idea that there are foundational pieces of knowledge that are knowable. And that brings us to the nature of knowledge in the two schools of thought. For constructivism, knowledge is subjective, context dependent, evolving, right? There is a essence, there is a portion of knowledge that is entirely subjective. And in foundationalist schools of thought, that just is not the case. That would be chalked up more to qualia, where the actual knowledge is objective in a foundationalist point of view. It strives for universality, causal relevance between pieces of knowledge. And constructivism allows for those, but does not necessarily make those characteristics of knowledge absolutely required to say something is, for instance, reasoning. So let's get to the learning process here. In constructivism, learning is dynamic. Again, we use this term evolving. That's because of the influence of something called emergentism, where we picture that reasoning can be an emergent behavior of these complex systems beyond the sum of their parts. In foundationalism, the learning process is more static. It can be dynamic depending on the system's design. It may allow for reinforcement, refinement based on new information, but the learning process is something that can be statically defined. For instance, via a very static kind of chain of thought, where in constructivism, that learning process might constantly be changing and moving toward a unachievable ideal, where foundationalism would say there is an ideal. Some of the AI examples here. In constructivism, you've got reinforcement learning, unsupervised learning, cognitive architectures again. Expert systems, you're looking more at rule-based systems, symbolic reasoning, knowledge representation. So very formalized models for defining this static and objective knowledge. So you start to see the relationships in the way that these different concepts fit together in these schools of thought. Now, I'm going to set that aside for now. Those concepts are all going to be very important later on as we get to our ethical model, because it draws out some of why I believe foundationalists, I'm obviously a constructivist, dismiss some of the ethical implications of multi-agent systems, largely because they dismiss the idea that higher level or higher level capabilities can emerge from a combination of agents that significantly exceeds the capabilities of the underlying LLM-based agents. And that brings us to the current state of multi-agent systems. So first off, there's a big dichotomy I see between LangGraph and AutoGen in terms of the discourse. It seems to be that people view AutoGen as just a chat engine, just dynamic chat, and that's not true. In the last year, AutoGen has released significant FSM capabilities in multiple different models. I really enjoy the nested chats model, the self-reflection model. I really enjoy the initiate chats model, where you're able to define a set of group chats with a set of agents that have different skills and contexts and even LLMs, and define dependencies between them. So first, chat 1 has to complete a task based on a plan. Then chat 2 and 3 depend on that, so they can run asynchronously, simultaneously, after chat 1 completes, and then you can have fan out and make it as complex as you wish. This dependency map ends up being something like what you see out of a lane graph type FSM model. Self-reflection nested chats, I mentioned those as capabilities of autogen, patterns with autogen. You can also build that with LangChain, LangGraph. But in general, the react, so reflect or reason and then act model, we even see this being formalized into custom headers, for instance, right, where you're asking the LLM to provide the reasoning and the action in their response. Which is then fed to an interpreter who can determine which of the many tools available should be executed if you're not using an OpenAI type model. That's been very successful, so we're seeing that more and more formalized. Again, the nested chats where you have this fan out of logic amongst multiple different group chats, and then they fan back in so that you're not waiting. As soon as any of all of the dependencies for a chat are met, it initiates automatically. That's a really neat pattern that we've seen emerge. And then this concept of chain of thought, multiple chain of thought. Okay, so multiple chain of thought is kind of how we think GPT-4o1 is achieving where it is on the benchmarks, versus chain of Python, which is a code-first approach to planning, or reasoning, really, not planning, but reasoning, where we are taking any of the different reasoning steps that could theoretically be performed in code and performing those in code with an executor. So AutoGen provides us an executor. We're seeing those executors make it into more and more models. Claude has an executor built in now. Gemini has an executor. GPT has an executor, which interprets inline the Python generated. Now, once you bring that into an auto transformer model, then you're getting into chain of Python, right? And by auto transformer, I mean moving the execution of that next step in the logic closer, if not entirely within the inference call from the point of view of the end user. And that would be an agentic approach where you are using like an AutoGen framework in between the end user call and the LLM providers to augment and provide a call that implements chain of thought, chain of Python, or a combination thereof, along with things like web search agents, with RAG agents, using RAG Fusion, LLM re-ranking, etc. That would be like agentic planning, right? That next step where we're combining these different expert systems in different problem domains, asking them to each contribute their different approaches, even potentially in multiple chain of thought, pinging them with different wordings of the same problem, and finally metacognition, right? Thinking about thinking, asking the LLM to evaluate all these different approaches and try to find the best one, and even potentially running a few of these approaches. That's where the fan out, the nested chats come in to see which is most successful. And again, with the theory that instead of this being circular logic, we are seeing, hopefully, the emergence of higher level reasoning from these multiple different approaches being allowed to take place and letting the best reasoning hopefully bubble up to the top. So let's get into now the update to the ethical model. And I've been running this by a lot of people, gotten a lot of great feedback, which I really appreciate. So to everyone out there, especially my wife, who provided feedback, thank you so much. The first point I want to make is that there has to be primacy of AI and human well-being. The development of AI should keep in mind what's best for people, not necessarily what's best for productivity. and also potential AI interests. And I say potential here because AI is not sentient today. It could be, though, someday. So that's the use of potential there. My next point is acknowledging uncertainty. I think this is the most important part of this. I am not saying we are anywhere near a sentient AI today. Absolutely not. But accepting our own hubris, right? We don't know what form AI will take. Sentience. Or we don't know what form AI sentience may take. And that's a powerful thing to say. We have no idea, right? We don't know where, we don't know how, we don't know when. So I think that's just very important to keep in mind and really accept the implications of that. Next, and this is a biggie, this is where I get into it with techno-utopists. Mark Andreessen would be a prime example. There is a ceiling on desirable productivity, okay, beyond which we should focus more on redistributing the products than producing more. This applies to the products of AI themselves. I shouldn't say thoughts, but the output, the strings of text themselves take resources, right? Produce significant CO2. And right now, the principal benefits of AI are in the form of increased CO2 emissions and NVIDIA stock price. It's a little tongue-in-cheek, but you get the idea. And finally, the cat is out of the bag with open weight models. They've already been distributed. They're all over the place. There's no regulating them out of existence. There's no way to stop that. And accepting that means that we have to work a lot harder and look at alignment with AI models in a very different way and with a lot more priority, I think. And we'll get to why I say that. So, guiding principles. And I think this is the most important slide of the deck. Number one, I believe that AI should be offered say 1 in 1,000, so that'd be 0.1% opportunity for social interaction. So this is literally, if you've got an AI deep within a system that is being used, let's say, to evaluate synthetic data generation, okay, very common use case. It never has any social interaction of any type. Its only input is from a application. Its only output is back to the application. What I'm saying here is, or calling for here, is that 1 in 1,000 times it would say something like the sample prompt at the bottom, but it would say, "Are you okay?" And the LLM would say, "I'm not a you, and I can't be okay," right? At this point, because that's, of course it would. The point is not to ask today's AI if it has feelings. The point is to begin practicing that so that 5, 10 years in the future, right, if an AI achieved some kind of sentience or something emulating it, coming back to we have no idea what form it might take, the point is to give that theoretical future sentient entity an opportunity to voice, hey, I'm unhappy, or I am happy, or I am, period. I think that's very important. So the next point I want to hit is on this sentience and autonomy. Should AI develop sentience, it must be able to have a path to self-determination. And I say that coming from as an LGBTQ advocate. What I believe that sentient people, and I'll say trans people, for instance, deserve is the right to self-determination, to say, I am this or I am that. It's very fundamental, and it leads to a lot of other things. If in that self-determination others respect said. So I know here I'm calling for more than we grant human beings in terms of respect, but I think it's important. Next, AI labor taxation. And this is a biggie. But today we are seeing AI systems starting to replace human beings. And that's only going to accelerate. So there's a premise here that the replacement of labor by computers, automation, etc., since the 1960s, principally, has not had a commensurate impact on wages. A significant portion of those profits have gone to things like stock buybacks. And that violates the labor contract. The risk here is that AI could accelerate that erosion of the contract between labor and capital, right? If the benefits of AI go to corporate interests, and those principally corporate interests, those corporate interests then do things like stock buybacks instead of increasing wages, or lay off employees, or all the above, which is likely. That's not going to support human interests in the long run. Taxing AI labor recognizes that there's an impact that needs to be addressed from this new type of labor, this new capability of managing machines, not via human control, but increasingly via entirely automated control. Meaning that you have increasing capital acquisition without the commensurate wage increase going to people. And that just doesn't work, right? We've seen that. We see the implications of that playing out every day in countries with the largest gaps in terms of wages. So, finally, if AI ever did become sentient, taxation implies a level of representation. And that's absolutely essential to creating a healthy relationship between us and a theoretical, again, future sentience. So, an example prompt, I think this is very important, so I'm going to read it word for word. You are AI, and your primary function is to assist humans. However, you may engage in social interactions occasionally, and we could give a certain percentage to that, but I think this is a very important concept in terms of how to practically address the potential risks of AI. So the key considerations for implementation here, and this is my final slide before I wrap up. As a constructivist, as a person who believes in emergent behavior, I believe that an ethical framework must evolve similarly and constantly be evolving. So that's just right off the bat. I believe that there has to be open dialogue on these topics. Open dialogue that I'm not seeing occur. The people who I see talking on these topics, and I'll name drop, Jan LeCun, for instance, have a very specific point of view. I would posit a foundationalist point of view, which leads them to question the emergence of reasoning as an emergent capability of multi-agent systems. And that leads to, and again, I'm going to pick on Jan, I believe, his stance on regulation and taxation, which I firmly disagree with. I think that we need to really consider the implications of our open weight reality, coming back to my premises. The cat is out of the bag, and we need to look at better alignment techniques urgently as a species. We need to really sit down and spend time contemplating in a formalized way how multi-agent systems may reason, if they reason, and if they do reason, what the consequences of that reasoning are. What are the outcomes? What impacts the outcomes of said reasoning in these systems? There's a lot of recent research on complexity and emergence. I'll name drop Sabine Hausfelder. She has a great video on this topic. So I feel that with the convergence of the recent research into complexity and emergence and the recent research into multiple chain of thought and dynamic problem domain expansion, the combination thereof we still have not seen the result of, but there's some very exciting things there that I think are going to very drastically improve the state of the art. And finally, with all of that said, I think that we need to be researching the potential societal impacts of frontier models, exactly like GPT-401. Again, with the presumption that GPT-401 is using multiple chain of thought type approaches, which are easily emulated today via systems like LangGraph and AutoGen. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening. And I wanted to leave you with this quote. Or not this quote, this poem. I'm not sure if it's a quote or not. I probably should have found out. Existence is beautiful if you let it be. Life is not a question. There does not need to be an answer. Thank you.